Detroit, 1994. A 7-year-old boy vanished from his bed in the middle of the night. The only clue was a single crayon drawing of his imaginary friend. While the city searched for a lost child, one veteran detective realized the boy hadn't been drawing a fantasy. He had been sketching the face of a wanted killer who had vanished years before. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The world of 7-year-old Jamal Parker was a universe drawn in crayon. In the cramped, 2-bedroom apartment he shared with his mother in a forgotten corner of Detroit, every surface was a potential canvas. The back of a utility bill, a stray napkin, the plaster of his own bedroom walls, all were covered in the bold, bright, waxy strokes of his imagination. He drew superheroes with mismatched capes, fire-breathing dragons that looked suspiciously like the neighbor's angry dog, and sprawling, chaotic cityscapes. Jamal didn't just like to draw, he needed to. It was how he processed the world, how he spoke his quiet truths. In the autumn of 1994, a new character began to dominate his artwork. This character was not a superhero or a monster. He was a man named Mr. Ray. At first, Jamal's mother, Tanya, was delighted. Her son, a quiet and often lonely child, had finally invented a friend for himself. "So, who is this Mr. Ray?" she asked one evening, trying to smooth out a fresh drawing of the man that Jamal had proudly presented to her. "He's my best friend," Jamal said, his voice serious, his eyes focused on adding a crooked smile to the man's face. "He lives downstairs." Tanya's smile faltered for a moment. They lived on the second floor of a dilapidated 3-story apartment building. The unit below them was supposed to be empty, boarded up after the last tenants had been evicted. But she quickly brushed the thought away. It was just the logic of a child's fantasy. "What does Mr. Ray look like?" she asked, playing along. "He's got a shiny head, no hair at all," Jamal explained, his crayon moving with a practiced confidence. "And he has a white line on his face, right here." He drew a thin, jagged scar on the man's cheek. "And he smiles like this." He added a lopsided, almost sneering grin. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Ray became a constant, invisible presence in their apartment. Jamal would have long, whispered conversations with him in his room at night. He would save half of his cookie for him. And he would draw him, over and over, with a startling, obsessive consistency. Every drawing featured the same details: the bald head, the crooked smile, the pale scar. Jamal's stories grew more detailed. Mr. Ray, he said, would visit him at night after his mom had left for her nursing shift. He would bring him candy, the kind Tanya didn't allow him to have. He would tell him stories about the city, about secret places and hidden treasures. He told Jamal that their friendship was a special secret, a game that no one else could know about, especially not his mom. For Tanya, this was all just further evidence of a rich and perhaps slightly concerning fantasy life. Her son was a latchkey kid in a tough neighborhood. His father was long out of the picture, and she worked the night shift, leaving him in the care of an elderly neighbor for a few hours before he went to bed. Of course he was lonely. Of course he would invent a friend, a secret, nocturnal protector who brought him treats and adventure. It was sad, but it was harmless. A coping mechanism. It was, she told herself, just a phase. She had no way of knowing that her son was not inventing a fantasy. He was documenting a reality. In the quiet, lonely hours of the night, in the supposed safety of his own bedroom, Jamal Parker was being visited by a real-life monster. And with the innocent, unwavering accuracy of a child who did not yet understand the concept of a lie, he was drawing a perfect, detailed portrait of a killer. Tanya Parker's life was a constant, exhausting exercise in forward motion. At 29, she was a single mother navigating the treacherous landscape of 1990s Detroit, a city that felt like it was slowly crumbling around her. She worked the night shift as a licensed practical nurse at Detroit Receiving Hospital, a job that was a chaotic blur of beeping machines, hushed family crises, and the relentless, managed suffering of strangers. Her world was one of 12-hour shifts under harsh fluorescent lights, of a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could ever truly erase. But the moment she left the hospital and stepped into the gray light of dawn, Her focus shifted entirely. Her universe shrank to a single brilliant point of light, her son, Jamal. He was the reason for the long hours, the missed sleep, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that was the soundtrack to her life. Everything she did for him. Her love for him was a fierce, protective thing, a fortress she had built around his quiet, imaginative world. But the walls of that fortress were constantly being tested by the realities of their life. Their apartment building was a grim, concrete block, a place where the hallways smelled of stale cooking and despair, where police sirens were a more common sound than birdsong. She did her best to make their small space a haven, a place of warmth and color. But she could not protect him from the loneliness that seeped in through the cracks. It was this loneliness, she believed, that had given birth to Mr. Ray. When Jamal first started talking about his new friend, Tanya had listened with a mixture of amusement and a quiet maternal ache. She saw it as a cry for attention, a manifestation of the void left by an absent father and a mother who was often just a tired, fleeting presence in his life. "Jamal, honey, you know Mr. Ray isn't real, right?" she would say gently, trying to ground him in reality. "He's a friend you made up in your head, and that's okay. But you know the difference." Jamal would just look at her with his serious, unblinking eyes and nod, a gesture she interpreted as understanding. She didn't realize it was the quiet, patient nod of someone who knew a truth that the adults around him were simply unable to see. Her dismissal was not born of neglect. It was the logical, rational conclusion of an exhausted mind trying to make sense of a child's world. She was a nurse. She dealt in facts, in charts, in measurable realities. Imaginary friends were a common, well-documented phase of child development. There was no room in her diagnostic worldview for a scenario in which the imaginary was terrifyingly real. The details Jamal provided, the stories of the candy and the secret nighttime visits, were concerning, but she filtered them through this lens of fantasy. The candy was just a wish-fulfillment fantasy for a kid who loved sweets. The nighttime visits were just dreams, the product of an overactive imagination in a quiet, empty apartment. "You have to stop telling stories, Jamal," she said one night, a new firmness in her voice. She had found a candy wrapper under his bed, the kind she never bought. She assumed he had gotten it from a friend at school and was incorporating it into his Mr. Ray narrative. "I know you're lonely, baby, but making things up is not the answer." The look on his face in that moment was one she would later replay in her mind 1,000 times, a look of profound, quiet hurt and confusion. He was not a child caught in a lie. He was a witness whose testimony had just been rejected. He was telling her the truth, in the only way he knew how. And she was, with the best of intentions, telling him he was a liar. This misunderstanding, this tragic gap between a child's literal reality and an adult's logical interpretation, was the space in which the monster was allowed to operate. Tanya, in her loving, protective, and utterly rational dismissal of her son's imaginary friend, was unknowingly giving the predator his greatest shield. She was convincing her own son that the man who was sneaking into his room at night was a secret that was best kept to himself. She was doing what she thought was right, what any good mother would do. And in doing so, she was leaving the door to her son's world wide open for the monster to walk right in. The end of a night shift for Tanya was a slow, weary crawl towards the promise of sleep. On a cool, damp morning in early November, she walked from the bus stop to her apartment building, her body aching, her mind a dull, foggy landscape. All she wanted was to check on Jamal, who would be fast asleep, and then collapse into her own bed for a few precious hours before he woke up for school. She unlocked the 3 deadbolts on their apartment door, a ritual of urban survival, and stepped inside. The silence that greeted her was different. It was not the peaceful, sleeping silence she was used to. It was a deep, hollow, and unnerving emptiness. A cold, sharp tendril of fear snaked its way through the fog of her exhaustion. "Jamal?" she called out softly, her voice a dry whisper. There was no answer. She walked down the short hallway to his bedroom. His door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, and the world tilted on its axis. The bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back, the small indentation of his head still visible on the pillow, but her son was gone. The first wave of denial hit her. He's in the bathroom. He's in the kitchen getting a glass of water. He woke up early and is watching cartoons in the living room. She moved through the small apartment, a frantic, silent search, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bathroom was empty. The kitchen was empty. The living room was dark, the television screen a blank black mirror reflecting her own rising panic. He was gone. She stumbled back into his bedroom, her mind refusing to accept the impossible reality. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a clue, for an explanation, for anything that made sense. And then she saw it. The window. It was an old, sash window that was usually locked and painted shut. Now, it was cracked open, just a few inches, a dark, vertical slash of night air. The sight of that open window shattered the last vestiges of her denial. This was not a child who had wandered off. This was something else. Something terrible. Her legs gave out from under her, and she sank to the floor, a strangled, guttural sob escaping her lips. Her hand landed on a piece of paper on the floor, near the foot of the bed. It was one of Jamal's drawings. She picked it up, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it. It was another drawing of Mr. Ray, but this one was different from all the others. It was the most detailed, the most carefully rendered portrait he had ever done. He must have spent hours on it. The bald head was perfectly shaded. The crooked smile was more of a sneer, a look of chilling, predatory confidence. And the scar on the cheek, it was no longer just a simple line. It was a jagged, raised, and terrifyingly realistic mark. But it was the eyes that stopped her breath. In all his other drawings, Mr. Ray's eyes had been simple circles. In this one, they were dark, detailed, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a monster. In that instant, as she stared at the drawing, a horrifying, sickening realization washed over her. It was a truth so monstrous that her mind had refused to see it until now. Mr. Ray was not a fantasy. He was a real person. And he had been in this room. He had been with her son. The drawing was not just a picture. It was a message. It was a portrait of a kidnapper, left behind by the victim. It was the first and only piece of evidence in a crime that had been committed in the silent, unseen hours of the night. The imaginary friend was real, and he had stolen her son. The full, crushing weight of her own dismissal of Jamal's stories, of her own failure to listen, came crashing down on her. The monster had not just taken her son. He had told them he was coming, and she had refused to believe it. The 911 call was a torrent of raw, unfiltered panic. A mother's primal scream for help funneled through a telephone line. The initial response was swift. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 patrol cars were painting the grim gray walls of the apartment building in frantic, silent strokes. The first uniformed officers to arrive were young, professional, and followed their training by the book. They secured the apartment, which was now a potential crime scene, and began asking Tanya the standard, necessary questions. Was there a custody dispute with the father? Did Jamal have a history of running away? Was there any chance he was with a relative or a friend? Tanya, her mind a maelstrom of guilt and terror, answered their questions with a desperate, ragged impatience. No, 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 she insisted, her voice rising with each denial. Don't you understand? He didn't run away, he was taken. She thrust the crayon drawing of Mr. Ray into the lead officer's hand. This is him. This is the man who was visiting my son. His name is Mr. Ray. The young officer looked at the drawing, his expression a mixture of professional sympathy and a deep, ingrained skepticism. He saw a child's drawing, a well-executed one perhaps, but a doodle nonetheless. He had seen 100 grieving, frantic parents, and he had learned that in the first chaotic hours of a crisis, their theories were often wild, unreliable, a product of their fear. He made a note in his logbook. Mother claims victim was visited by an imaginary friend and gently handed the drawing back. The case was quickly and correctly escalated. A missing 7-year-old from a locked apartment was not a simple runaway case. It was a potential abduction, and the file landed on the desk of Detective Miles Corrigan in the Detroit Police Department's Homicide and Missing Persons Division. Corrigan was a man who seemed to be carved from the same weary, crumbling concrete as the city he served. He was in his late 50s, a few years shy of a pension he wasn't sure he wanted. His face was a roadmap of his career, etched with the lines of too many sleepless nights, too many grieving families, too many unsolved tragedies. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a man who had learned long ago that impatience was a detective's worst enemy. He arrived at the Parker apartment, just as the sun was beginning to cast a weak, watery light over the city. He walked into the small, tense space, and his presence immediately lowered the temperature in the room. He did not bombard Tanya with questions. He simply introduced himself, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, and he asked her to tell him about her son. Tanya, who had felt dismissed and unheard by the first officers, found herself looking into a pair of eyes that were filled not with skepticism, but with a deep, profound weariness that bordered on empathy. She told him everything. She told him about Jamal's love of drawing, his quiet nature, his loneliness, and then, her voice cracking with a guilt that was a physical pain, she told him about Mr. Ray. She told him about the stories, the candy, her own dismissal. She showed him the drawing. Unlike the younger officer, Corrigan didn't just glance at it. He took the piece of paper and he studied it. He held it up to the light. He looked at the confident, consistent lines. He looked at the specific, repeated details, the bald head, the scar, the crooked smile. He had interviewed hundreds of child witnesses in his long career. He knew the difference between a fantasy and a memory. A child's fantasy was fluid, inconsistent, always changing. But a memory, especially a traumatic one, was often a series of sharp, vivid, and unchangeable details. This drawing, he realized, was not a doodle. It was a statement. It was a piece of testimony. "You did the right thing by calling us, Miss Parker," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And you did the right thing by keeping this." He carefully placed the drawing in a clear plastic evidence bag. "I promise you," he said, looking her directly in the eye, "we are going to find your son." It was a promise he had made to 100 other mothers, a promise the city often made it impossible to keep. But as he looked at the haunting, crayon-drawn face of the kidnapper, he felt a cold, familiar certainty. This was not a random act. This was the work of a specific, identifiable monster. And the only witness had just given him a perfect, full-color portrait. The first 24 hours of a missing child investigation are a frantic, desperate race against a fading trail. For Detective Corrigan and his team, the search for Jamal Parker began with a frustrating, almost total lack of actionable intelligence. The world immediately outside the Parkers' apartment was a wall of silence. Corrigan's team of detectives, a mix of young, eager rookies and jaded veterans like himself, hit the ground running. They established a command post in the grimy lobby of the apartment building and began the methodical, soul-crushing work of canvassing the area. The building itself was a vertical neighborhood of the forgotten, a place filled with people who had learned that the surest path to survival was to see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing. They knocked on every door. Most went unanswered. Those that did open were met with a uniform response of shrugged shoulders and averted eyes. The fear of crime in the neighborhood was so endemic that it had curdled into a kind of terminal apathy. People didn't talk to the police. They didn't get involved. It was a code of silence born not of malice, but of exhaustion. "Did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" the detectives would ask. "Sirens," a woman answered from behind a chained door. "Heard sirens. Hear 'em every night. What else is new?" They interviewed the elderly woman who was supposed to be watching Jamal. She was a sweet, frail woman who admitted she often dozed off in her chair after she had tucked Jamal into bed. She hadn't heard a thing. They searched the grounds around the building, their flashlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. They were looking for a footprint, a dropped object, a scrap of fabric, anything to indicate a point of entry or an escape route. But the grounds were a wasteland of broken pavement and neglected, overgrown weeds. The trail was hopelessly cold. The silence of the community was a physical, tangible obstacle. It was a form of passive resistance that Corrigan understood, even as it infuriated him. These people weren't protecting a criminal. They were protecting themselves from a world that had taught them that engagement only brought trouble. Their silence was a symptom of the deeper urban decay that allowed predators like the one who took Jamal to operate with impunity. This was a neighborhood full of ghosts, a place where a 7-year-old boy could be stolen from his bed without a single person noticing. With the external search yielding nothing, Corrigan's focus turned inward, back to the one place where he knew there were answers: Jamal's bedroom. He and a forensic technician spent hours in the small, crayon-covered room, treating it with the same meticulous care they would a major crime scene. They dusted the open window for fingerprints, but the old, weathered wood was too porous to hold a clean print. They examined the lock, which seemed to have been jimmied open with a thin piece of metal. It was a quiet, professional entry, not a brute force one. But the most compelling evidence was not forensic, it was artistic. Corrigan had seen the first drawing, the one Tanya had found on the floor. But as they carefully went through the room, they began to find more. Tucked under the bed, taped to the back of the door, slipped inside the pages of his favorite superhero comic book, more drawings of Mr. Ray. Each one was a small, chilling piece of a larger, terrifying puzzle. The consistency of the drawings was what struck Corrigan most. In every single one, the man had the same bald head, the same lopsided smile, the same jagged scar on his left cheek. This was not an imaginary friend. This was a portrait of a man who had been a regular, secret visitor to this room for weeks, maybe even months. The wall of silence outside was impenetrable, but within these four walls, the victim himself had been screaming for help, a silent, colorful alarm that no one had been able to hear. As the first day of the investigation drew to a close with no ransom call, no witnesses, and no viable leads, a deep sense of dread began to settle over the precinct. The odds were getting longer with every passing hour. But Corrigan was not ready to give up. He knew the answer was not in the silent streets or the shuttered apartments. The answer was in the crayons. He was holding the key to the entire case in his hands. He just had to find the lock that it fit. With no witnesses and a community locked in a code of silence, Detective Corrigan knew that the only person who could tell him what had happened to Jamal Parker was Jamal himself. The boy's voice was not on any 911 tape or in any interview room. It was in the silent, colorful pages of a cheap, spiral-bound notebook they found on his small, cluttered desk. Corrigan took the notebook back to the precinct, handling it as if it were the most important piece of evidence he had ever collected. He sat at his worn metal desk under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the squad room, and he began to turn the pages. It was like stepping into the mind of a 7-year-old. The first few pages were a typical explosion of childhood imagination. Lopsided rocket ships, smiling suns with sunglasses, a very lumpy-looking dinosaur. But then, about a third of the way through the notebook, Mr. Ray appeared. The first drawing was simple, almost hesitant. A round, bald head, 2 dots for eyes, a single, curved line for a smile. The only distinguishing feature was a small, red crayon mark on the cheek. But on the next page, the drawing was more detailed. The smile was now distinctly crooked. The scar was a more defined, jagged line. On the page after that, the figure had a body, a tall, thin man in a dark jacket. As Corrigan turned the pages, he was watching a relationship unfold in crayon. He was witnessing the slow, methodical process of a predator grooming his victim. He could see the progression, from a simple, friendly face to a more complex and ultimately more sinister figure. In the later drawings, Mr. Ray was no longer just smiling. He was holding a piece of candy out to a smaller figure, presumably Jamal. In another, he was pointing to a secret door drawn at the bottom of the page. It was a chilling, heartbreaking narrative, a visual diary of a child's abduction, drawn in real time. Page after page was filled with the same haunting face. The consistency was undeniable. This was not a character that changed and morphed like a typical imaginary friend. This was a real person, drawn from life, from memory, with the unwavering, literal precision of a child. He called in a police sketch artist, a young woman with a talent for translating the fragmented memories of trauma victims into coherent faces. He showed her the notebook. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, her voice a hushed whisper of awe and horror. "This isn't a memory sketch. This is a portfolio." The kid was the primary witness, the sketch artist, and the reporting officer, all rolled into one. She used the dozens of drawings to create a single, composite sketch, a professional, black-and-white rendering of the face that had been haunting Jamal's notebook. She captured the bald head, the deep-set eyes, the thin, cruel line of the crooked smile, and the jagged, puckered scar on the left cheek. When she was finished, she held it up next to the last, most detailed drawing Jamal had made. The resemblance was uncanny. Corrigan now had a face, a real, tangible face. He had it blasted to every officer in the department. He had it sent to the local news stations. "Have you seen this man?" the news anchors asked, their voices grave as they held up the sketch next to a smiling school picture of Jamal. The tips began to pour in, but they were all dead ends. People seeing a vague resemblance in a neighbor or a stranger at the grocery store. The face was distinctive, yet it matched no one in their current databases of known offenders. The notebook was a ghost story. It was the detailed, illustrated testimony of a child who had been visited by a phantom, a man who seemed to exist only in the quiet, lonely world of a 7-year-old's bedroom. But Corrigan knew better. Ghosts weren't real, but monsters were. And this monster had made a single fatal mistake. He had allowed his victim to keep his crayons. The composite sketch, born from a 7-year-old's crayon drawings, was a powerful tool, but it wasn't getting them any closer to finding Jamal. For days, Detective Corrigan and his team chased down dozens of fruitless leads, their frustration mounting with each passing hour. The face of the man they now called Mr. Ray was everywhere on the news, on flyers, in the paper, but he remained a ghost, a phantom with no name, no history, no place in the official world. Corrigan was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was telling him that this was not the work of a new, unknown offender. The quiet, patient, and methodical nature of the crime, the slow grooming of the child, the clean, professional entry and exit, it all spoke of experience. This was not a man's first monstrous act. He had done this, or something like it, before. This face had to be somewhere in their records. The problem was the sheer volume of those records. The Detroit Police Department's archives were a vast, dusty necropolis of forgotten crimes, a labyrinth of paper files that predated the digital age. To search for a single, unnamed face in that mountain of paper was a near impossible task. But Corrigan was a man of bulldog tenacity. He started with the basics, searching the files for any known local criminals who matched the general description. The search was a slow, mind-numbing process of pulling file after file, staring at grainy, black and white mugshots, looking for a match. He spent hours, then days, in the stale, musty air of the records room, the faces of 1,000 forgotten criminals blurring together before his tired eyes. He found nothing. The pressure on the department was immense. The story of the missing boy and his crayon drawings had captured the city's heart. It was a story that was both terrifying and poignant, and the public was demanding answers. Corrigan felt the weight of it all, the weight of a city's hope and a mother's unbearable grief. One night, unable to sleep, he was back in the archives, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, the composite sketch lying on the table in front of him. He was staring at the scar on the man's cheek. It was the most distinctive feature, the one detail that had been present in every single one of Jamal's drawings. He had been searching the records from the 90s, but what if this man was an older ghost? What if he had been active years before, and had simply gone dormant? On a hunch, he decided to go deeper into the archives, into the files from the previous decade. He began pulling the fugitive files from the 1980s, a particularly violent and chaotic era in Detroit's history. These were the ghosts of the ghosts, the cold cases that were so old they had been all but forgotten. He worked his way through the years. 1989, 1988. The files were thick with the faces of hard, desperate men. He was about to give up for the night, his eyes burning with fatigue, when he pulled a file from late 1988. The name on the tab was Raymond Harris. He was wanted for an armed robbery that had gone bad, a liquor store heist that had left the owner and a clerk dead. The suspect had vanished without a trace, his case file a monument to a perfect getaway. Corrigan opened the file, and he froze. Staring back at him from a faded black and white mugshot was a face he had come to know intimately over the past week. A bald head, deep-set, empty eyes, a crooked, sneering smile, and there, on his left cheek, was a thin, jagged, and unmistakable scar. It was him. The face in the 6-year-old fugitive file was a perfect, one-to-one match for the composite sketch born from a 7-year-old's crayon drawings. Mr. Ray had a name, And he was not just a kidnapper. He was a wanted murderer. The ghost had a history, and it was a history written in blood. The discovery in the archives sent a jolt of pure, high-voltage electricity through the entire investigation. The squad room, which had been thick with the grim, stagnant air of a failing case, was suddenly buzzing with a renewed, ferocious energy. They were no longer hunting for a shadow. They were hunting for Raymond Harris, a known, named, and incredibly dangerous fugitive. Detective Corrigan felt a cold, professional thrill, the feeling a hunter gets when he finally picks up the scent of his prey after a long, fruitless search. The match was the breakthrough they had been praying for, but it also opened up a host of new, terrifying questions. How had a man who had successfully vanished for 6 years suddenly resurfaced? And how, of all the places in the city, had he ended up in the same run-down apartment building as Jamal Parker? The pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place with a horrifying speed and clarity. The name Raymond Harris gave them a history to work with. His old case file contained a list of known associates, old addresses, a partial psychological profile. He was described as a loner, a man with a history of hiding out in abandoned buildings, of living off the grid. He was a creature of the city's forgotten spaces. Corrigan and his team turned their attention back to the apartment building, no longer seeing it as just a collection of homes, but as a potential hiding place. They pulled the building's original blueprints from the city archives. And they found it. A detail that had been overlooked in the initial search, a detail that no current resident of the building would have known about. The blueprints showed a separate, sealed-off basement unit, an old custodian's apartment that had been officially condemned and walled off in the late 1970s after a fire. It had no official entrance from the main building. It was a forgotten room, a void within the structure of the building itself, and it was located directly beneath Tanya and Jamal Parker's apartment. A cold, dawning horror settled over the detectives. Harris hadn't just been visiting Jamal. He had been living, like a spider in a wall, just a few feet beneath the boy's bedroom floor. They began to piece together his method. The old file mentioned that Harris had once worked as a part-time handyman. He would have known how to read blueprints. He would have known about the city's network of old, interconnected utility tunnels and steam pipes. They theorized that he had found a way into the building's sub-basement through the city's underbelly, and from there had discovered the sealed-off apartment. It was the perfect hideout, a place where he could exist, completely unseen, in the heart of the city. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle was how he had gotten into Jamal's room. A careful re-examination of the blueprints, combined with a new, more invasive search of the building's structure, revealed the answer. There was an old, disused service crawl space, a narrow vertical shaft for plumbing and electrical conduits that ran up the entire height of the building. And there was an access panel to that crawl space in the back of a closet in the abandoned basement unit, and another, long-forgotten access panel in the back of the closet in Jamal Parker's bedroom. The full, horrifying picture was now complete. Raymond Harris had been living in the sealed-off basement. He would have been able to hear every sound from the apartment above the television, Tanya's comings and goings, and, most importantly, the lonely, quiet sounds of a 7-year-old boy, alone in his room at night. Using the crawl space, he had been able to sneak into Jamal's closet, a real-life boogeyman, a monster emerging from the shadows. The grooming, the candy, the stories, it was all part of a patient, meticulous plan. He had been turning the boy's bedroom into an extension of his own hidden lair. The dots, which had once been a scattered, nonsensical collection of a child's drawings, were now connected, and they formed a straight, terrifying line that led directly to the basement beneath Jamal's empty bed. The narrative of Raymond Harris's life was one of parasitic survival. He was a man who had learned to live in the cracks of the world, in the places that other people had abandoned and forgotten. After the botched robbery in 1988, he had simply stepped out of the official world and into the city's shadows. His greatest skill was his ability to become invisible, to exist without leaving a trace. The abandoned custodian's apartment beneath the Parker family was the perfect ecosystem for a predator like him. It was a forgotten space, in a forgotten building, in a forgotten neighborhood. It was a place where no one would ever look for him because, officially, it did not exist. He had likely spent years there, a ghost in the machine of the city, subsisting on petty theft, his presence completely unknown to the dozens of families living just a few feet above his head. From this subterranean lair, the world of Jamal Parker would have been an intimate, audible drama. He would have heard the boy's solitary play, the one-sided conversations with his toys, the muffled sounds of the television. He would have learned the rhythms of the small family's life. The sound of Tanya leaving for her night shift, the long, quiet hours when the boy was alone. He would have sensed the loneliness, the vulnerability, the deep, unmet need for a friend. For a patient, manipulative predator, Jamal was the perfect target. The grooming process would have been a slow, methodical masterpiece of psychological infiltration. It would have started with sounds, a soft tapping from inside the closet, a quiet whisper. He would have introduced himself as a secret, a game, a magical friend who lived in the walls. Then came the gifts, a piece of candy left on the floor of the closet, a small, cheap toy. These were offerings, tokens designed to build trust and create a sense of special, shared secrecy. He slowly, carefully, broke down the natural barriers of a child's fear, replacing them with a sense of curiosity and excitement. He was not a man. He was Mr. Ray, a magical, nocturnal playmate. He would have used the information he overheard to his advantage. If Jamal was upset about being picked on at school, Mr. Ray would offer words of comfort and validation. If Jamal was sad that his mother had to work so much, Mr. Ray would tell him he was there to keep him company. He was custom building a friendship to fit the exact shape of the void in the little boy's life. The most crucial element of his control was the insistence on secrecy. He would have framed it as a game. "This is our special secret, Jamal," he would have whispered. "If you tell anyone, even your mom, the game will be over, and I'll have to go away forever." For a lonely child, the fear of losing his only friend was a more powerful deterrent than any physical threat. Over weeks, or perhaps even months, he had created a deep, powerful bond of trust and dependency. He had established a secret, second reality that existed only in the quiet hours of the night, a reality in which he was the central, benevolent figure. The night he finally took Jamal was not an abduction in the traditional sense. It was the final, logical step in his meticulous grooming process. He had not snatched a child from a playground. He had simply convinced a friend to come and see his secret home. He had likely promised to show Jamal the hidden treasures he had talked about, the secret world that existed just on the other side of the closet wall. For Jamal, it would not have felt like a kidnapping. It would have felt like the ultimate adventure with his best friend. It was only when the closet door was closed from the other side, when the game was over and the friendly Mr. Ray was gone, that the horrifying truth of his situation would have begun to dawn on him. For Jamal, the transition from his bright, familiar bedroom to the cold, damp darkness of the basement was a slow, creeping nightmare. The adventure he had been promised by his friend, Mr. Ray, had curdled into a terrifying, confusing reality. The man who had been his secret, nocturnal confidant was suddenly different. The warm, conspiratorial whispers were gone, replaced by a cold, menacing silence. The crooked smile was no longer a sign of a shared secret. It was a look of absolute, chilling control. The basement apartment was a world of shadows and decay. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a weak, yellow light over a scene of squalor. The air was thick with the smell of mold, dust, and something else, something acrid and unpleasant. The furniture was a collection of broken, discarded junk. It was a place that felt utterly devoid of hope, a forgotten tomb beneath the living world. Raymond Harris, no longer the friendly Mr. Ray, led Jamal to a small, windowless storage room at the back of the apartment. Inside, there was nothing but a bare, stained mattress on the floor. "You'll be staying in here for a while," Harris said, his voice flat, emotionless. "It's a new part of the game. A quiet game." He pushed Jamal gently but firmly into the room. Before he closed the door, he handed him something. A small, tattered box of crayons. It was Jamal's own box, the one he had left on his desk. It was a strange, almost surreal gesture, a small, calculated act of psychological control. It was as if Harris was telling him, "You are still you. You can still draw, but you will do it in this new world, under my rules." Then he closed the door, and Jamal heard the heavy, metallic sound of a bolt sliding into place. He was plunged into a darkness that was near total, a darkness far deeper and more absolute than the familiar, comforting dark of his own bedroom. The first few hours were a blur of fear and confusion. He was not a child who cried easily, but silent tears streamed down his face in the suffocating blackness. He was scared, but more than that, he was profoundly confused. His best friend had turned into a monster. The game had turned into a prison. His 7-year-old mind struggled to make sense of the betrayal, of the sudden, violent shift in his reality. He huddled on the thin, cold mattress, his small body trembling. He could hear the muffled sounds of Harris moving about in the main part of the apartment. He could hear the faint, distant sounds of the city above, the rumble of a passing bus, a distant siren, sounds from a world that was now 1,000,000 miles away. He was a prisoner, but he was also still Jamal. And what Jamal did, what he had always done to make sense of the world, was draw. His fingers fumbled in the darkness, finding the familiar, waxy shapes of the crayons in the small box. He crawled off the mattress and felt his way to the wall. The surface was cold, rough concrete. He picked a crayon, he didn't know what color it was, and he began to draw. In the total darkness of the locked room, his mind became his eyes. He drew the only thing he could think of, the face that was now burned into his memory. He drew a bald head. He drew a crooked smile. He drew a jagged scar on the cheek. He was not just doodling. He was testifying. He was creating a record. He was externalizing the monster, trapping him on the wall, an act of quiet, courageous defiance against the terrifying darkness that surrounded him. In the suffocating darkness of the locked storage room, Jamal Parker found his voice. It was not a voice that could scream for help or plead for his release. It was the quiet, determined voice of his crayons. The act of drawing, which had once been a joyful expression of his imagination, now became a desperate, fundamental act of survival and communication. It was the only thing he could control in a world that was utterly out of his control. He had no idea if it was day or night. Time had dissolved into a single, long, terrifying present. His only measure of its passage was the sound of the bolt on the door. Twice a day, Raymond Harris would open the door, place a small plate of food and a plastic cup of water on the floor, and then lock the door again, often without saying a single word. The friendly, talkative Mr. Ray was gone forever, replaced by this silent, menacing jailer. During the long, silent hours in between these grim visitations, Jamal drew. He had his small box of crayons, the ones Harris had so carelessly given him, the tools of his own undoing. They were in his pocket when he was taken. He used the rough concrete walls of the storage room as his canvas. The darkness was absolute, so he drew from memory, his fingers tracing the familiar shapes, his mind providing the images. He drew his mother, her smiling face a beacon of warmth in the cold, damp air. He drew his apartment, his bed, his toys, a visual prayer for a world he was desperate to return to. These drawings were a way of keeping his old life alive, a refusal to let the darkness erase the memories of the light. But mostly, he drew him. He drew Raymond Harris. He drew the face of Mr. Ray over and over, not as a friend, but as a monster. He drew the face large, filling an entire section of the wall, a giant, looming specter. The act of drawing the monster was an act of defiance. It was a way of taking the terrifying image that haunted his mind and trapping it on the wall, of externalizing the fear, of making it something he could see and control, even if only in crayon. He knew, with the simple, unshakable logic of a child, that what he was doing was important. He was creating a message. He didn't know who would see it. He didn't know if anyone would ever see it. But he had a profound, intuitive sense that he needed to leave a record. He needed to tell the story. The crayons began to wear down, becoming small, stubby nubs in his fingers. He used the last of his black crayon to write words underneath the largest, most detailed portrait of Harris. His handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven on the rough surface of the wall, but the message was clear, a desperate, 7-year-old's plea for belief, a final, heartbreaking validation of the truth he had been trying to tell all along. He didn't know that just a few floors above him, a weary detective was looking at his notebook and finally beginning to understand. He didn't know that a search was being planned, that a team of armed officers was preparing to descend into his dark, hidden world. He only knew that he was alone, that he was scared, and that he had a story to tell. And so he drew a final, desperate message in the dark, a crayon witness waiting for his testimony to be seen. The atmosphere in the squad room of the Detroit Police Department was thick with a tense, controlled urgency. The discovery of Raymond Harris's identity had transformed the case from a frustrating mystery into a high-stakes, time-sensitive manhunt. They were no longer just looking for a missing child. They were trying to rescue a child from the clutches of a known, violent killer. Detective Miles Corrigan stood in front of a large, hastily assembled tactical map of the apartment building. He was a man transformed. The weary, slow-moving veteran was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused commander. His voice was a low, steady rumble as he briefed the members of the SWAT team, a group of grim-faced, heavily armed officers who listened with an intense, professional stillness. "Our target is Raymond Harris," Corrigan began, his finger tapping the faded mugshot that was now pinned to the map. "He's been a fugitive for 6 years. He is wanted for a double homicide. He is to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. Our primary objective, our only objective, is the safe recovery of the child, Jamal Parker." The plan of attack was fraught with risk. A direct frontal assault on the main building was out of the question. It would cause a panic and could easily tip off Harris, giving him time to harm the child or use him as a hostage. They had to get into the basement unit without him knowing they were coming. Their investigation into the building's blueprints had given them the key. They had discovered an old, sealed-off coal chute on the exterior of the building, a relic from a time when the building was heated by a coal furnace. According to the blueprints, that chute led directly into the sub-basement, the same area from which they believed Harris was accessing the abandoned custodian's apartment. It was their way in. "This will be a silent, stealth entry," Corrigan explained, his gaze moving across the faces of the SWAT team. "We cut through the chute, we get into the sub-basement, and we clear it. From there, we locate the entry point to the sealed apartment. We do not breach that apartment until we have visual confirmation of the boy's location and status. The life of that child is in our hands. We will not fail." The tension in the room was a palpable thing. Every officer there knew the stakes. Raids were their bread and butter. But raids involving a child hostage were a different kind of beast. There was no room for error. The slightest mistake, the slightest unexpected noise, could have catastrophic consequences. As the team prepared their gear, checking their weapons, adjusting their body armor, a profound, grim silence settled over them. They were about to descend into a monster's lair, a hidden subterranean world in the heart of their own city. They were going to war in a place where the battlefield was a series of dark, narrow hallways, and the only non-combatant was a terrified, 7-year-old boy. Corrigan looked at the composite sketch, the one born from Jamal's crayons, which was still pinned to the board. It was a stark, powerful reminder of who they were doing this for. They were not just rescuing a victim. They were answering the call of a witness, a 7-year-old boy who had stared a monster in the face and had possessed the incredible courage to draw what he saw. The plan was set. The team was ready. It was time to bring Jamal Parker home. Under the cover of a moonless, overcast night, the raid began. A fleet of unmarked police vans rolled to a silent stop a block away from the apartment building. The SWAT team disembarked, moving with the fluid, silent efficiency of ghosts, their dark tactical gear blending into the shadows of the decaying urban landscape. They were a wave of controlled, disciplined force, preparing to crash against the hidden shore of Raymond Harris's secret world. Detective Corrigan, too old for the dynamic entry but too invested to stay behind, watched from a command post set up in the back of a van, his eyes glued to the grainy, black and white feed from a camera mounted on the lead officer's helmet. The team moved to the back of the building, to the location of the sealed-off coal chute. 2 officers, using a hydraulic cutting tool that made only a low, powerful hum, began to work on the rusted metal plate that covered the opening. The process was agonizingly slow, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, with a soft groan of tortured metal, the plate came free. The opening was a black, gaping maw, leading down into the unknown darkness of the building's underbelly. One by one, the officers slipped through the opening, descending into the sub-basement. The helmet cam footage that Corrigan was watching was a disorienting, terrifying journey into the earth. The air was thick with the dust of decades. The only sounds, the soft, shuffling footsteps of the officers and their own harsh, controlled breathing. The beams of their powerful flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a subterranean labyrinth of massive, ancient pipes, forgotten machinery, and the skeletal remains of old furniture. It was a place that time had completely forgotten. They followed the blueprints, moving with a tense, practiced slowness through the maze. Finally, they found it. A section of the concrete wall that looked newer than the rest. It was the place where the old custodian's apartment had been sealed off. There was no door, but a careful inspection revealed what they were looking for. A small, almost invisible ventilation grate near the floor. It was their only way to get eyes and ears inside. An officer with a specialized fiber-optic snake camera carefully removed the grate and threaded the thin, flexible lens through the opening. The view on Corrigan's monitor switched to the grainy, color feed from the snake cam. It showed the interior of a dark, squalid room. The room they now knew was Harris's lair. The camera panned across the room. It was empty. A bare mattress lay on the floor in one corner. A small table with the remains of a meal sat in another. But there was no sign of Harris. And more importantly, no sign of Jamal. A cold knot of fear tightened in Corrigan's stomach. Had they gotten it wrong? Was he not here? Then, the camera operator focused on a closed door at the far end of the room. A storage room, according to the blueprints. A heavy industrial bolt was slid across the outside of the door. Someone was locked inside. It had to be him. The team leader's voice came over the radio, a low, tense whisper. "We have a locked interior door. We believe the child is inside. We have no visual on the suspect. We are preparing to breach." Corrigan's heart was in his throat. This was the most dangerous moment. If Harris was in there with the boy, this was where it would all go wrong. "Breach, breach, breach," the team leader commanded. The officer at the front of the stack used a small, powerful battering ram. The first hit on the door sounded like a gunshot in the confined space. The second hit splintered the wood. On the third, the door burst open. The team flooded into the storage room, their weapons up, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices a torrent of loud, overwhelming commands. "Police, show me your hands. Get down on the ground." The final, desperate moments of the raid were a study in controlled chaos. As the SWAT team burst into the main room of the abandoned basement apartment, they found it empty of life, a ghost town of squalor and decay. The tension was at a fever pitch. The primary target, Raymond Harris, was nowhere to be seen, but the heavy bolt on the storage room door was a silent, damning testament to the presence of his captive. The team leader made a split-second decision. 2 officers would hold position, their weapons trained on the dark, unexplored corners of the main room, while the rest of the team focused on the storage room. The breach was a violent, explosive release of pent-up energy. The sound of the battering ram splintering the old wooden door echoed like a cannon shot in the confined concrete space. They poured into the room, their powerful flashlights flooding the small, windowless space with a blinding, overwhelming light. And they saw him. Huddled on a bare, stained mattress in the far corner was a small, terrified boy. It was Jamal Parker. He was alive. He was physically unharmed. A collective, unspoken wave of profound relief washed over the heavily armed, battle-hardened officers. Jamal stared at the dark, hulking figures, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. One of the officers, seeing the boy's fear, immediately lowered his weapon and knelt down, his movements slow and gentle. "It's okay, son," he said, his voice a soft, reassuring rumble. "We're the police. We're here to take you home to your mom." As the officer spoke, the beams of their flashlights played across the walls of the small concrete room, and then they saw it. Covering the wall behind Jamal was a gallery of horrors, a mural drawn in the bright, innocent colors of a child's crayon set. There were drawings of his mother, of his home, of superheroes. But dominating the entire space was a massive, terrifyingly detailed portrait of a man's face. A bald head, a crooked, sneering smile, a jagged white scar on the cheek. It was the face of Raymond Harris, and beneath the portrait, in the large, shaky, and unmistakable handwriting of a 7-year-old, were 5 heartbreaking words. A final, desperate message to a world he thought had forgotten him. "Mom, Mr. Ray is real." The sight of that message, a child's plea for belief drawn on the wall of his prison, was a gut punch that hit every officer in the room. They were not just looking at a crime scene. They were looking at the last will and testament of a 7-year-old's hope. They had been led here not by forensic evidence or by a secret informant, but by the unwavering, artistic testimony of the victim himself. It was the most powerful and most poignant piece of evidence any of them had ever seen. The crayon on the wall was not just a drawing. It was a confession, a witness statement, and a verdict all rolled into one. The monster was real, and the child he had terrorized had just given them the final, irrefutable proof. The rescue of Jamal Parker was a moment of profound, triumphant relief. But the operation was not yet over. Raymond Harris was still unaccounted for, a dangerous, cornered animal hiding somewhere in the dark, subterranean maze of the building's underbelly. As 2 officers gently wrapped Jamal in a tactical blanket and carried him out of the darkness and into the world of the living, the rest of the SWAT team began a methodical, nerve-wracking search of the rest of the basement complex. They found him, not in a hidden room or a secret passage, but in the last place anyone would have thought to look. Acting on a hunch, Detective Corrigan, monitoring the operation from the command van, had remembered a detail from the original blueprints. The old coal chute. He radioed the team leader. "Check the chute." The delivery chute from the alley. 2 officers went outside and approached the old, rusted metal door of the chute. It was closed, but not locked. They wrenched it open and shined their powerful flashlights down into the dark, narrow, and impossibly deep shaft. And there he was. Cowering at the bottom, covered in decades of coal dust and filth, was Raymond Harris. The monster who had terrorized a child and haunted a city for 6 years was found hiding in a hole in the ground, a fitting end to his parasitic existence. The standoff was brief and anticlimactic. Faced with a dozen heavily armed officers, he surrendered without a fight, his face a mask of sullen, defeated rage. The reunion between Jamal and Tanya was a scene of pure, primal, and overwhelming emotion that transcended the chaos of the police operation surrounding them. When Tanya saw her son, a small, blanket-wrapped figure being carried out of the building's dark, gaping mouth, she broke through the police line and ran to him. They collapsed into each other's arms, a mother and son, reunited, their sobs the only sound that mattered in a world that had, for a few terrible days, been stripped of all sound and sense. "You were so brave, baby," Tanya whispered, her tears soaking into his hair. "You were so brave." Jamal, his face buried in his mother's shoulder, just held on. The terror of the past few days finally giving way to the profound, absolute safety of her embrace. The story of what had happened in the apartment on the west side of Detroit became an instant sensation, a story that shocked and captivated the nation. It was a story that had all the elements of a modern urban fairy tale. A monstrous, hidden villain, a desperate, loving mother, a weary, determined detective. But at its heart, it was the story of a 7-year-old boy who had, through a unique and incredible act of courage, become the hero of his own rescue. The media called him the crayon witness. He was the child who had sketched his captor before anyone believed him, the boy who had unknowingly solved his own abduction. The drawings from his notebook and the haunting final message on the basement wall were shown on every news channel, a powerful, chilling testament to both the terrifying darkness of a predator and the incredible resilience of a child's spirit. Raymond Harris was charged, and with the overwhelming evidence against him, was convicted and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a place where he could no longer harm anyone. The other cold cases he was suspected in were reopened, and his capture brought a final, grim closure to other families who had been waiting for answers for years. For Jamal Parker, the journey of healing would be a long and difficult one, but he was not alone. He had his mother, whose love was now a fierce, unshakable fortress. And he had his crayons. In the end, it was not the monster who had defined his story. It was the art. It was the quiet, unwavering truth of a child who, when faced with an unimaginable evil, had picked up a crayon and drawn what he saw, a single, courageous act that had brought a monster out of the shadows and into the light.